God was a million miles away. He abandoned me. There was no hope, and I was in complete darkness, and I was alone.
So Travis, what was life like before you met Emily, and how did your addiction start?
Well, I really grew up in a, what everyone consider, or what people would consider a godly conservative home. We were in church every time the doors were open. And on the outside and externally, it looked like we had the perfect little family. But I was exposed to pornography by my dad between the ages of like 9 to 11. And then there was sexual abuse that was going along side of the exposure to pornography. And that continued from a pretty young age. I don't remember specifically, all the way up until my early teenage years. When I was 16, everything that my dad had done started to come out, and he ended up getting sentenced to prison. I realized that no matter how stressful or chaotic or hurt I was, whenever I was partaking in anything sexual, I felt wanted, I felt loved, I felt needed. I felt safe and free, I guess. And so in that safety and in that freedom grew this addiction that became my chains, really, that later on in life really began to have devastating effects. I was married once before, and that addiction destroyed that marriage. And then I met Emily, and obviously, as we'll talk about, it nearly destroyed our marriage as well.
And so, Emily, what was your life like before you met Travis?
When I graduated from high school, soon after that, my parents moved to Arkansas, and so it was just me in our house alone. And so I remember having friends, high school friends over for parties and things like that, and just trying to find ways to not feel so lonely. And then soon after that, I started to do dating websites like eHarmony, and then that morphed into looking for boyfriends on Craigslist and just getting myself into really not good situations. That's people doing drug transactions, me holding the cash for them, thousands of dollars, and just all these things that I just look back and like, how did I get myself in that situation? I was very fortunate not to end up in a ditch dead. And then a few months later, I discovered that I was pregnant, and I had to tell my pastor dad that, I was gonna have a baby. And thankfully, my family was very loving and accepting, and they were there for me during that time.
How did you guys meet, and what was kind of that process leading into marriage?
We first met in October of 2011, but we didn't really start hanging out until Travis was around for Christmas in 2011. Actually, I later found out that he was in the Air Force, and he was back home because he had attempted suicide while he was in Oklahoma City on base at the Air Force Base. And so after that, he had come back home, and that's when we started talking. And I didn't know any of that stuff when we were talking. I was pregnant and lonely, and he was kind of reeling from his marriage, him and his wife being separated. And so we just kind of started talking. And
so when did you guys get married?
In June of 2014.
And how long after until you really started seeing kind of just, I guess, the manifestation of his addiction? How long was that process? Or did you always know?
Well, the moment where I really saw it was actually just a few months before we got married in February. That's when I made my first real discoveries of online dating websites that he was on, and I would find emails and Craigslist ads and things like that. And we went through counseling with our pastor, and I remember I read through my journal entries, and I was depressed and anxious, and I don't really know how we ended up getting married when I look back at it, because I was still finding out things. But he proposed to me in March of 2014, and then we got married in June. And all throughout that time and after we got married, every few months I would discover something.
So Travis, after you guys got married, did marriage fix it?
No, I mean, it was constantly going on. I mean, even through all these happy events, engagement, marriage, honeymoon, it was always still there. And I set a list of, rules for myself and different ways I thought that I'd be able to manage my addiction to minimize the damage that would occur. Because I did really genuinely love Emily and Gideon, and I didn't want to hurt them. But I didn't believe that I could change, so my only option really was to try to control my addiction the best I could. And so, I set guidelines like no physical affairs, or don't really fall genuinely in love with anyone. And just things that, looking back now, it's, seem really stupid. But because I was just so deep in this pit of addiction, and I had no hope, and I saw no way out, my only way that I thought I could survive was to follow these rules. But obviously, sin is powerful, and once you start down that road, you just get in deeper and deeper. And so, eventually I broke those rules that I had set for myself. And, Emily eventually discovered those things.
So where was the moment where you stopped managing an addiction and you started getting serious? I'm sure that there was some form of breaking point, rock bottom. What was that moment like?
So for me, it was really August of this past year. We'd been to a wedding in June a couple months prior, and I think Emily had experienced a pretty big breakthrough at that point.
So we went out of town and for the wedding, and we were up there, and I was in the hotel room, and I just felt like I should look at his phone. And on his phone, I discovered a ton of emails, conversations between him and tons of other women. Conversations talking about, I want to have a baby with you, things like that. And that phrase especially was so hurtful to me because we had been trying for 2 years to have a baby. And so that broke my heart. And then I talked to him about it, and we obviously didn't reach a resolution because we were at a wedding and everything. But I had to put on that happy face and try to celebrate the wedding. And on the drive home, I started doing research on sexual addiction, and I discovered a book about sexual addiction and being married to an addict, and I learned about betrayal trauma and how it's a real thing. It finally put a name to something that I'd been feeling for 2 years, how it manifests itself as very similar to PTSD. And I finally I didn't feel crazy for once. I was like, oh, other women have gone through this, and they felt this, other men too. And I'm not alone. And then through more research, I learned more about addiction, and I was finally able to say, okay, there's Travis and there's his addiction. They're not the same thing. They're two separate things. Travis isn't his addiction. And I was able to start loving my husband for who he really was and not just see his addiction.
And so Travis, but you felt contrary to that because you stated to Emily that you are attached to your addiction, and that I remember you saying, as long as you're with me, you'll continue to get hurt because this is just who I am. And so what was the moment that really began to change that?
Yeah, and I did. I genuinely believed I was my addiction. I believed that if you took the addiction out of me and all of those sexual things that I was partaking in were gone, that I would self-destruct. And it was really a huge turning point in our marriage when she made that distinction that I wasn't my addiction. Because then she was able to truly believe that I could change and fight for our marriage in a way that neither one of us had experienced before. And so you fast forward 2 months after that wedding to August, and a woman that I had been having inappropriate relationship with, basically an ongoing affair for several years, she finally said, hey, I want money, basically blackmailed me, or I'm going to tell your wife all this stuff. And, I told her no, and she followed through on her threat.
From my view, I was sitting at home just hanging out with our son, and suddenly I got a message on Facebook, a message request from somebody that I didn't know, saying that my husband had a second Facebook, he was on Snapchat, and he'd been talking to this woman for years and years, and just all sorts of things that just, like, at that point I felt like we had been doing pretty well. He had started going to therapy, started an accountability group on a weekly basis, and so this, it was a slap in the face, and I had no idea what to do at this point. That evening, his mom came over and watched Gideon, and we went for a drive, and we were going to go and talk.
We got in the car after work to discuss everything, and we're driving, and there wasn't anger on her side. And in a way for me, it's frustrating because here I am, I'm thinking, okay, this is it, this is the moment, my marriage is done, it's over with, maybe I'm free to get out of this, I'll stop hurting her, and I'll be able to self-destruct on my own. But that wasn't her attitude at all. She firmly believed that there was hope, and she firmly believed that I could change, and she firmly believed that God was going to restore our marriage. And I think she even used, God's going to use our story. And I'm like looking at her like, you're insane. This is who I am. I cannot change. There is no hope. I don't even know where God is because he hasn't made himself visible to me in any way, shape, or form. He's abandoned me. I'm alone. Everything is dark. And I'm hopeless. And through a conversation with my pastor, he said to me, you're not alone. There are all these people around you, your therapist, me, your pastor, your wife, your mom, your family, your friends, all these people that are godly people, biblical counselors that are trying to help you. You just need to stop listening to yourself, stop making your own foolish decisions, and trust those people around you. And so Emily had set up a counseling session with my therapist. And, we get in the car to go to this session, and I'm thinking, we've done this before numerous times. This is a waste of time. This is a waste of money. This is stupid. Like, why are we doing this? And I don't know what it was. It was just one of those moments when God makes himself real to you. It was like a little ray of light started to shine on my dark, cold, decrepit heart. And I just decided by really no merit of my own, no reason. I just all of a sudden decided, okay, God, I'm going to listen to whatever it is my therapist suggests I try, whatever Emily wants me to do, whatever it's going to take for me to change, I'm going to do it. And, you know, I've joked that if my therapist would have told me to go to the top of Sears Tower and jump off 7 times into this net, and I would have been cured of my addiction, that I would have done it. If I would have, you know, had to go to some rehab clinic for a couple months in-depth therapy, I would have done it. Yeah. I just, for some reason, I had this realization that I've tried everything else. I've tried it my way. And it always led to more hurt, more pain, more lies, more devastation. And I was tired of hurting, and I was tired of hurting people. And I was all in at that moment for whatever it is that God, you know, wanted me to do in order to change.
So Emily, I think it takes a lot of courage on your part, because I think that's one of the biggest pieces that makes this story so powerful. Is it's not just Travis's recovery or, you know, road to wholeness or healing, but it's the fact that you still chose to fight for him, and even though it's affected you in a real way, you know, your heart's broken, it's hard to trust, and yet, you know, I think a lot of people would want to know what was going on in your head and on the inside of you that's like, I could probably quit, and everyone would think that it's okay, but I'm not going to. People probably think that you're more crazy because you're staying.
Well, that's totally true. I actually had, you know, I was part of some online support groups during this time, and, you know, everybody told me, you know, my husband never changed, you know, you're not going to be able to change him, and you should just leave him. And, you know, God wanted me to do something different. He led me to do something different. And I remember the day before we met with the therapist, you know, that was a spiritual warfare filled day. I remember one of my friends had sent me a Bible passage. She texted it to me. And I remember sitting at the table, and I'm just speaking it out loud. I'm reading through the Bible verses and kind of crying it back to God. And that was the first time that I really felt like, you know, I felt God's presence there. I felt like there was a spiritual battle going on, and me saying those words out loud, his words back to him, it was helping me to be able to defeat all those negative thoughts in my mind, all the images that Satan was trying to put back in my mind. That's where, you know, I was feeling victory. Yeah. And I was feeling a closeness to God that I'd never felt before. So through all of this heartache, I was able to become closer than I've ever been to God. And I was able to finally, for the first time in my life, depend on him, yeah, which was really cool.
Yeah. So here you guys are now, and what would you have to say to other people that may be facing the same thing in their marriage or even as individuals?
I mean, as someone who's an addict, you believe these lies that you are your addiction. That's a lie. You're not your addiction. And you believe you can't change, and that's another lie. Like, there is hope, and you have to be willing to do whatever it takes. You know, authentic transformation requires drastic change. You have to be willing to cut things out of your life that you thought you would never have been able to give up. I mean, for me, it was my phone. I remember a week after that counseling session that really was a breakthrough moment for us. I was at an accountability meeting, and I'd had a rough week. You know, I'd had a breakthrough at the counseling session, but I'd really struggled with some other things that week, and I was like, I'm about to jump right back in to this pit again. And I didn't want to continue that cycle. And so I asked one of my accountability partners to set a restriction on my phone, and he did that. And I remember driving home, and it was pouring down rain in Kansas City, and I am bawling my eyes out having this worship session with God, because all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I had asked for help, and that was huge for me. And I remember I get home and I probably like barge to the door, like I'm amped up, and then I walk over to Emily, she's sitting on the couch, and I hand her my phone, and I said, babe, can you take my phone and change the pin on it? So set a passcode that I can't get into my own phone. Because for me, one of the biggest obstacles that I had failed to overcome was my phone. It was a point of weakness for me. And I think it was the last thing that I had always been unwilling to surrender to God. And that moment was like my moment of true repentance. It was my sign to God that you can go into the deepest and darkest corners of my heart and you can clean house. And you know, it's difficult at times to not be able to get into your own phone. It's embarrassing, it's humiliating. Like, I remember we were in the Sprint store and doing some different things, and she needed to get into my phone, and I would have to hand it to her to put the pin in, for her to hand it back, and it's just awkward. But you have to ask yourself, what is the cost? Yeah. And if you truly want to change, you know, no matter if it's a job, no matter if it's home internet, TV, a tablet, a laptop, a phone, whatever it may be, if it's causing you to continually to struggle and to fall into your addiction, you have to be willing to cut it out. And once you remove that from your life, it's God will do the rest. Yeah. Because in the 3 months since that moment, the amount of grace, I mean, I lived for 15, 20 years with this overwhelming addiction where there were times when I wanted to stop and I would have these physical withdrawals and I'd be shaking and sweating, and it would just overwhelm me and I would eventually give in. And now I look back over the last 3 months, and I mean, there are days that have been difficult and I've had struggles and temptation, but the grace that God has given me to be victorious in a way that I never thought was possible. And it's incredible, and it's all God. And you just, once you're willing to give up everything and give your life over to Him and fully trust in Him, He does the rest, and it's incredible. That's good.
Emily, would you add at all to anything for viewers, people out there? Like, you know, what would you say after all of this?
Well, I just say to people who are married to addicts, that can be husbands or wives, that there are other people who are going through the same things that you're going through. And sometimes it takes being vulnerable, admitting what's going on in your life, even just opening up to one person, finding one person that you can trust. I know not everybody wants to go out on camera and, you know, open up their life to everybody else, but even just opening up to one person that can just be an encouragement to you and pray for you. I'd say that's pretty big. That's been pretty big for me. Just being vulnerable with people and open with people and not trying to put on this mask that everything is perfect, and just being real. And then trusting in God to take care of it, not trying to control everything myself, just giving up control to God. That was probably the other biggest thing for me, is just not micromanaging my life. God's got my life managed. He can handle it. I don't need to take over control.
So what I'm hearing from both of you, to reach where you are today, there was just a lot of willingness to surrender to the Lord's leadership. I'm just trusting. You know, maybe there was a lack of trust in each other, but you trusted the Lord.
And so for me, there was a passage that was really big. It's Isaiah 45:2-3, and it talks about how God will go before us and He'll knock down the iron gate and He'll clear out the path, and He'll go into the darkness and He'll get these secret treasures and He'll bring them out and give them to us. And I remember I was sitting in bed and I was going through some recovery books when I hit this verse, and it was like all of a sudden I could see. My eyes were open to the reality that everything that I had experienced, the sexual abuse, the sexual addictions, you know, the wrong things that were done to me, my innocence was robbed, and I blame that for years and years. And then my addiction, all of those things, God is now taking and he's molding them into this story of hope. And if I had never been through those things, I wouldn't be sitting on this couch today sharing what he's done in my life. And so to anyone that's going through difficult circumstances that seem overwhelming, there's a promise there in Scripture where God says, all those dark moments, I will turn them into treasures that you will value and will be worth more than anything you could ever imagine. And now I can look back, and it seems crazy, but I can be thankful in a way for the abuse. And I can be thankful in a way for the addiction. And it's not that I would ever want anyone else to have to go through that, or that I would want to go through it again. But it's a part of me, and it's a part of us. And it's given us this story of grace, of hope, and of love. And when God's at the center of that, it's powerful stuff.